Russia's Strategic Aims, in Consequence to a Collapsing U.S. Empire by Alastair CROOKE. Former British diplomat, founder and director of the Beirut-based Conflicts Forum.
Alastair CROOKE writes that ineffective leadership has let the European Pandora's box out. The situation is becoming insane. Even though EU leaders are all repeating the same good news talking points, they nevertheless exude a general unease. This is likely a reflection of the psychological stress they are under as a result of saying things like Ukraine is winning, Russia's defeat is coming, while simultaneously knowing that Europe has no chance of defeating a sizable Russian army on the continent of Eurasia. Even the Colossus of Washington limits the employment of American military might to fights that the United States could afford to lose, wars lost to weak adversaries where the conclusion was incontrovertibly a victory rather than a defeat. However, waging war, financial or military, with Russia is very different from suppressing weak rebel movements that are dispersed and weakly armed, or from bringing down the economy of fragile governments like Lebanon. The initial American arrogance has collapsed. As warned by Western leaders, Russia did not internalize the effects of Washington's financial attack or undergo a catastrophic regime upheaval. Washington miscalculated the strength of Russian society, the hidden military capability, and the country's relative resistance to Western economic sanctions. What the Russians will do next is what the West is concerned about. Will they continue to deplete NATO's arsenal while also wearing down the Ukrainian army? Or deploy the Russian offensive forces that are amassing across Ukraine? The Russian strategy is to keep the West guessing and off balance by maintaining the ambiguity between the threat of the offensive and its execution. General Gerasimov is well known for his use of psychological warfare. When, where, and from where will it arrive? We are unsure. The timing of Russian actions will depend less on the political calendar in the West and more on when and if an offensive serves Russian goals. Additionally, Moscow is focused on two fronts: the military crisis and the financial conflict, which would support a slower military deployment to allow for levels of economic hardship to build up, which may or may not favor the slow incremental destruction of the Ukrainian capacity to fight at all. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a former senior advisor to the U.S. Defense Secretary, predicts the deployment of a sizable force soon. Perhaps he's right. Taking into the broader context, Russia is principally working to undermine American hegemony and drive NATO out of the Asian heartland. Russians have long recognized the unsustainable nature of the global order system. Post-World War II structures are already clearly visible in the rearview mirror. Russia and China agree that there is no elegant or quick method to dismantle such a vast structure. They understand that the West cannot be trusted and will ultimately collapse. Russia and China have been reorganizing their economies and bolstering their forces for some time in anticipation of the eventual fall of the American empire, while crossing their hopes that the fall won't usher in the apocalypse. In reality, Russia and China have worked hard to slow that collapse as much as possible. Nobody would gain from the United States collapsing out of control. There is no other choice since the U.S. is going too far with its plans for Ukraine, and Russia will use this conflict to help end the American empire. As the American conservatives Kelly Bucar-Vlahos points out, American groups have been preparing Russia's burial for a long time. One of the most damaging revelations from the Twitter Files exposé by Matt Taibbi was how aggressive congressional lawmakers and federal agency officials were, in pushing a cynical narrative that brought the social media giant to heel while setting up the Russian bogeyman that haunts U.S. foreign policy and posturing in the Ukraine war today. The fabrication that Russia attempted to subvert American democracy helped win support for starting a new conflict with Russia. This battle for existence must continue right now. One could say that Europeans and Americans live in a bubble where everything is optics and all is PR drama. However, we all need to participate in this game. Unfortunately, they may be projecting the same zeitgeist onto the Chinese and the Russians, assuming that they must think similarly. There are no values or beliefs other than whatever appeals to the MSM. From this angle, it is clear that there is a cultural mismatch that reflects the Western lack of empathy. The West may believe that after hostilities cease, things will carry on as usual because Putin, like Macron, Scholz, and Biden, is preoccupied with ratings. However, they could not comprehend that this is different from how the rest of the world thinks in a meaningful sense. The idea that war is business exists within this thinking. Thank you, but please send us F-16s. As soon as the United States, Germany, and other NATO nations announced the significant release of main battlefield tanks for Ukraine, Kyiv began requesting the provision of F-16 fighter jets. Yuri Sak, a defense official for Ukraine, blatantly remarked on the relative simplicity of overcoming the next big hurdle of purchasing F-16 fighter jets. First they refused to provide us heavy artillery, but later they agreed. First, they refused to provide us HIMARS, missiles, but later they agreed. They now are providing us with tanks after initially refusing to do so. There is nothing left that we won't have, with the exception of nuclear weapons. This is a classic case of the war as business mindset, and politics is about accumulating wealth. Poland will be their bunker as F-16s won't be stationed at an airbase in Ukraine. Additionally, expanding the battle space to Poland would undoubtedly result in more war as a business and more use of tanks, APCs, and F-16s. There will be happy rubbing of hands from the military complex. The RAND Corporation, Pentagon-funded, analysis last week, which amounted to a forensic refutation of the justification for the war in Ukraine, only served to increase the war zealots' dissatisfaction with the West's collective failure to stem the tide of Ukrainian loss. Even though Ukrainians resist, it should be emphasized that the destruction of their cities and the collapse of their economy are not in line with Ukrainian interests. The report advises the United States to avoid a protracted conflict, characterizing a Ukrainian triumph as improbable and unlikely, and, most importantly, cautioning against the conflict spreading to Poland. Also underlined is the potential that the United States may unintentionally tip towards nuclear conflict over several issues. The RAND report is foresighted on this last point. This week, the head of the Russian delegation to the US publicly warned that should the West deploy armor-piercing depleted uranium or beryllium projectiles in Ukraine, as it did in Iraq and Yugoslavia with disastrous results, Russia would see this as the use of dirty nuclear bombs against it, with consequent repercussions. There can be no more questions about the Russian Red Line's location today. To be clear, consequences refers to potential nuclear retaliation from Russia. One has warned the West. Desperation is the result of frustration over the failed Ukrainian military endeavor. Victoria Nuland stated last week, "Like you, I am, and I think the administration is, very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you would say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea." This comment, more than anything else, demonstrates impotence. Translated, Nuland is saying, "Okay folks, we are not impotent as, wink, wink, we still managed to destroy the gas pipeline for the EU." Given that the tanks won't alter the course of the war, the entire PR drive for more tanks appears to be little more than a token effort to boost Ukrainians' morale and that of their allies in Europe. The political ideas advanced last week by Secretary of State Blinken and Victoria Nuland are comparable. They appear to have been chosen with the knowledge that, as it turned out, Moscow would reject them. To give the Blinken-Nuland team credit, even though neocons are terrible at carrying out their war programs, which nearly always end in disaster, they are masterful at persuading states to act as their allies against their national interests. The neocons have been allowed full rein to destroy Europe militarily, politically, and economically. The level of European servitude and the neocons' complete influence over EU leadership must astound the United States and the rest of the world. NATO's members have never been steadfastly united in support of Washington's campaign to damage Russia irreparably. The people of the EU, particularly those in France and Germany, have no stomach for body bags. But the neocons identified Poland, Lithuania, the other Baltic republics, and the Czech Republic as Europe's Achilles heel. The U.S. neocons joined this extreme Russophobic group, which wants to pacify and dismember Russia to grab control of EU foreign policy away from France and Germany. When the NATO door was thrown open to Georgia and Ukraine in 2008, the latter sat motionless and helpless in Bucharest. Why did they not voice their reservations at that time, as they claim they did? Weak leadership has opened the European Pandora's box, allowing all the long-buried grudges, rivalries, and bare ambitions to escape as ominous vapors. Can somebody now close the container's lid?